Rasasepä sykkun nihnamoo.
Scotty?
No, I'm sure, man.
Third man.
Yeah, get a guy like a banana off the plate. Well, the first reaction I have as I come out of the plane is that I've been hit by several billion tons of concrete, which tons of concrete don't have much meaning, and that's rather frightening. All these big metropolises are pretty frightening now. It's a major psychic affront. One loses the heavens. One loses the earth. One loses one's sense of one's own people. I'm just on a conveyor belt here. And as this city mushrooms into instant modernity, instant industrialism, my capacity, your capacity to relate to it and to be from it is reduced. I begin to see the first signs of the city. I know I've come home, and I know that I've come, whatever it is, 5,000 miles, for what I think of as a rendezvous with my own hometown.
The vision of the city that's far away, that's not part of us, that's somewhere up in that green cloud of forest. So it's the heavenly city that we can see. The problem is when you get closer to it and you get rid of that green cloud, it turns out not to be so heavenly. And that's one of the big tensions, I think, that we have about our downtown, that it looks terrific from a distance, but up close it poses very, very strong pressures on us.
Yonge Street would be wounded but not killed if this block were lost. But somehow the St. Charles Tavern, that crazy old tower, is still there. It should have been torn down decades ago, but as long as that's there, it's kind of a little tattered flag of resistance on behalf of humanity. But the enemy of Toronto and of Yonge Street are the monoliths. And yet the irony is that Toronto is exciting because of the monoliths. Toronto survives in this tension between its instinct for progress and making money and building monuments and Yonge Street's dirtiness and vulgarity.
On a typical morning, I take the lakeshore route in. It's symptomatic of the fact that I'm almost always in a rush and I'm trying to get somewhere at a particular time, and that southern route is also the quickest route. But in many ways, it's the most striking. It's the fabulous route. It's my favorite route because hanging on the far horizon is this comic book quality spaceship city. I don't mean that it's funny, but that it's so nicely concentrated, especially on the horizon, that it reminds me of the front covers of the great sci-fi comic books I used to read as a kid, where this jewel of a complex city used to sit.
Toronto is poised at a point where it has to choose between its destiny or becoming merely a nemesis. Toronto has to accept its destiny, which is to be a North American city with roots and with being concerned with decency and dignity and something more than hucksterism. Torontonians must either accept this destiny or be reduced merely to a nemesis, the nemesis of being another big North American city. That's where we are as we approach our 150th anniversary civically. And this is unique to Toronto, this particular combination of an earlier history, a Victorian Dowager Duchess presence, and then the enormous money towers. I can't think of any other city that literally has a gold money tower with the old roof of the Royal York against that rising gold pile. And suddenly, unlike approaching any American city, we're going to go under again, and you're going to dive below the money towers like a little rat going through a hole for some cheese. And then we're going to come up, presto, in the middle of the economic, cultural capital of Canada.
Shafts of light bouncing on metallic mirror structures, temples of commerce, fog on the harbor, visions of England, outpost of a long dead empire, insecure and perceptive, with brief flashes of brilliance. You lure me like a lover abandoned. I am drawn where dreams lie.
What was interesting about what John was talking the rest of it. I can remember my great-grandfather toasting the little new year. I mean, he's standing, he was about 6'4", and he died the next year at 90. He was the president of this company which my dad took over. He toasted the little new year, 1931. I was 5 years old. And it was on New Year's Day, and of course we'd all been listening, as we did every year, to the civic election results. And my grandmother, his daughter, as usual, had voted communist because she saw these names like Stuart Smith 10 years later. She voted, oh, that's a good WASP name. She got confused and phoned. Vote communist for Stuart Smith. And she'd done it again. She never voted for J.B. Salzburg because he was Ward 4 and that, you know. But I feel connected with 1867 or 1848. We are the salt of the earth, so give ear to us. No new ideas shall ever come near to us. Orthodox, Catholic, crammed with divinity. Damn the dissenters, hurrah for old Trinity. This is John Strawn's college, and perhaps the last of his many achievements. He really was the founding father of Upper Canada, and therefore Ontario, and York, and then Toronto. he ended up as the dominie, the master, the teacher of the whole family compact. But Strawn was a commanding presence in the city, the town of York and the city of Toronto from that time in 1813 right through to his death. The streets of Toronto were crowded. There'd never been such a funeral as that, which his coffin was carried through and buried in, under the high altar at St. James Cathedral. Strawn's arch enemy, of course, was another Scot, William Lyon Mackenzie, who edited the most popular newspaper that the province has ever seen. He invented the phrase family compact and turned all his scorn and his savagery onto Strawn. The Tory tradition, as represented by Strawn, and the radical tradition as represented by Mackenzie, were really cut off in 1837 by the defeat of the rebellion and, of course, the defeat of the family compact. New people took over, and the spirit of politics has been fairly centrist since then. It's been in favor of progress. It's related to the Toronto business community. Until perhaps progress in Toronto in the 1960s became just too much. Neighborhoods that we had known and had evolved for over 100 years were in danger of being obliterated by progress. We were having more growth in the absolute than either New York or Los Angeles, which are cities 5 times this size. And somehow the heirs of Strawn, as for example represented by the Rosedale Association, came together with the radicals and the populists. The new Mackenzie was obviously John Sewell, and somehow there was an alliance between these two groups of people who were both very conservative. They both looked to the past as their kind of utopia, and they were determined to prevent the philosophy of liberal conservatism or progress or whatever from taking over and obliterating and changing Toronto forever. So they put a hold on everything, and they expounded in various ways, saving old buildings, saving neighborhoods, planning growth properly, in executing the philosophy of small is beautiful, and stopping the view that if it's old, you tear it down. If it's green, you pave it over. These Tories and radicals, the two groups defeated in the rebellion of 1837, they took over the control of the city in the 1972 elections.
In terms of being a child or being young in Toronto, I found the boardwalk extremely powerful as an influence. I mean, it was the only place in Toronto where one was allowed to be an individual who, in fact, was pitted against the world. The rest of the time, you're always part of this great morass, but it was the boardwalk that allowed me, and I'm sure lots of other people, the opportunity of being dreamers and trying to figure out what one's stake in the world really was. You get the same feeling with the smokestacks, that you're walking on the boardwalk and you're sort of alone. But when it comes to it, obviously you aren't. You're in a city. And being on the boardwalk means that you're part of the city, even though you might also be on your own at the same time. But of course, this is where the city meets the lake. The city doesn't do that as often as it should. It's one of the few opportunities where this great big place that really sits on the lake, in fact, experiences the edge of it. And I always wish that had happened more in Toronto, that you could walk down Yonge Street and, in fact, say, this is the city that's built in the lake, and here's where Yonge Street starts, right at the foot of the lake. But it hasn't worked out that way, and it's sad. At least it happens here. what amazes me about traveling in the streetcar is that you see so much activity on Queen Street. There's so much variety. There's shops, there's people living above the shops, then you get into small apartment buildings, and great diversity. So that when you're riding in the streetcar, in fact, it's an interesting thing to do. It's not like the subway where you're simply trying to get somewhere as fast as you can. It's a ride that you can enjoy.
Eighth Avenue. Hey.
The design of the inside of the streetcar is really nice for people. Not only does it accommodate a lot of people traveling together, but it gives the people their own sense of space. The seats are divided into two, so you have your own place to sit. And everybody is looking the same way, so you get your own space in front of you, and it's private. You have your own window. You can put it up and down. You used to have the armrests, which they've taken off in the renovations. And even for the people who are standing, they've got their own window above that. So it's a very fine attempt to fit the individual into a mass conveyance vehicle. It's a perfect expression of how Toronto works, accommodating the individual, but having a good sense of groups of people working together. What's interesting about Toronto, it's sort of comfortable. It doesn't overwhelm you.
Well, that's the
it's
point.
Comfortable.
You-
well, that's
you
right.
have-
But this
you
idea
have
that
all
it's a
the
magnificent city or that
availability, you
people
have-
love it.
You have all the
availability.
availability of a modern
Do you?
cosmopolitan center.
Except you don't
without-
get beaten up in every
without
street
the
corner.
overwhelming
Yeah.
nature of trying to keep up with a New York or trying to keep up with a London.
Well,
And you don't get
I'm not
beaten
so
up
sure
on every
about that.
street corner. Well, we're getting down to basics here. I mean, we're into the heartland. This is where the fettuccine Alfredo connects to the bagels. I'm in love with this street. This is College. The part of College we're driving through now is, of course, the original Little Italy, and is so reminiscent for me of the neighborhood that I grew up in Montreal. And again, the connection between the immigrant waves, and to see where it all started, because, you know, they've all moved out and they've spread to the north and to the west and constitute this tremendously important presence in the city of Toronto. And still, it changes. It still changes. And only a little while ago, I found the most improbable little three-table restaurant tacked on haphazardly to a corner. Stepped in on an off chance and literally found a great guy, sensational Alfredo.
I'm glad. Well, it's my duty to do the best.
Your duty.
It's my interest to
You're
never
part.
Well, no, that's a spirit, you know.
This is one-man band.
That's one man band, of course.
What are your a really surprising place to take my fanciest, stuffiest overseas business you run till.
So I get my few bucks to carry on, that's all.
That's it. And here we have an Italian furniture and appliance store with Greek and Portuguese signs. Well, I'm in the total grip of nostalgia now. This used to be our family business. This was my dad's trade. I grew up working in it every Thursday night and Friday night, all day Saturday. And I was responsible for making the windows. I used to have to do up the windows. I'm concentrating on the female side because historically, shoe windows are divided by gender for some reason, I guess. Mixed marketing hadn't hit as a concept, but I used to take particular pains with the female window, and that was my greatest triumph, was selling a pair of shoes to a teenage girl who would typically come with about a half dozen friends. Working your way through that, I'm sure, had an important toughening value in my life. This is great stuff. It's exactly the way it used to look. It's ready to go. You wouldn't need an art director for this one. As vivid as my own sense has always been of not fitting. English speaking on a French street, Jewish in an Anglo-Saxon society, immigrant in an established middle-class community. You name it, I felt it. I never thought of it as an alial. I never thought that therefore my chances were diminished and that I had to hide and I was going to kind of rub my corners into nice smooth edges. No, I always thought of it as this was my edge. This was my little bit of definition, and it was going to be part of my fortune. The house I'm living in actually has a history. In Toronto, how much history is there to begin with? This place was apparently one of the little centers of Bohemia in Toronto at the turn of the century. The man who built it was, in fact, an architect called Charles Rennie Mackintosh. And so he built this home in what was then a country exurbia called Swansea. It was the radical modern structure of its time. That's the first poured concrete in the city of Toronto. Actually, I had drawn a line on a map, and it was bordered by Parliament on the east and Bathurst on the west, and St. Clair on the north and Front on the south, and had sternly said to my beloved that that's where I was going to live. And having done that, she brought me here one day. She found the house. And I knew immediately that it was a place to challenge me in any case, to see whether I could get a hold of it. And that this neighborhood had what I liked about cities, which is the juxtaposition of old and new. But my sense in Toronto is that things continue to loosen up. They really do. And that's consistent with being a world-scale city that's reflective of the positive opportunities of the new world. What happens when you take a tremendous mix of people, styles, and you shake them up in one place in a generalized atmosphere of civility, right? Real British-style civility. I love what the city is and is becoming more than I'm aware of what it used to be. But the city is a fairly fresh thing. For me, first of all, I only arrived in '65, and so that I should be electronic laureate to the city as its own kind of irony.
Moses is a new establishment, but what is wonderful is that his new establishmentarianism smacks greatly of the one I left, and I find that intriguing. You can never say go left or right in Rosedale. The roads are always curving around. It's an arabesque. It's like a courtly dance. It's not a grid. It's space for people and not space for geometry. Rosedale was special. It was very Toronto. It was very Canadian. It was the genteel tradition in Canadian terms. It couldn't be found in any equivalent English city. It was all turrets and gables and lace and gardens, and very wonderful. And to merely envy it is to prove that one is small in spirit. One should be proud of it. I'll never again live in Rosedale. I'll never have the money. And I'm glad it's there. We are like any other Midwestern North American city, except in one thing. We were founded by loyalists. We were founded by people who came north after the American Revolution because they affirmed certain values which related to the crown. Many of these were built by my grandfather, the architect, William Limbury Symons. And as I drive around Rosedale or walk around Rosedale at any time, I see his hand on many of the houses. We are about to turn into Drumsnap Road on the left, at the end of which is Drumsnab House, one of the great remaining Victorian, mid-Victorian Rosedale homes, which has now been completely restored and is one of the glories of this city and of this residential area, Drumsnab. You can see it now sitting private and unto itself at the end of this small street. Here's boys. It's one of the few we got. We historically and traditionally stand for decency, courtesy, a straightness in business and public life. But in this cynical 20th century, certainly this cynical decade, those qualities of decency, honor, courtesy are things that can bring tears to the eyes and hope to the soul. If Toronto was merely another huckster city of the American Midwest, we might as well throw in the sponge. What is the defining thing about us? It's our love affair with the city.
Love affair with
I
the
don't
city?
have a love affair with the city. I'm sorry about
Well, it may be too late for you.
that. That's right, yeah.
No, but you are the city, John.
Yes, that's true.
No, and this offhand decency is a result of the fact that a guy like John refuses to get chauvinistic. He refuses to get too impressed with
That's part of
himself and so
Toronto.
on.
Right.
And at its most benign, this is a very intelligent attitude. Where it is where it's part and parcel of what we also bemoan is where it's self-deprecating, where it's that perpetual inferiority complex that Canadians are always talking about. But John, you can't deny that our society has undervalued the arts. Our society has undervalued the media. Our society has undervalued the myths that keep us together compared to that fabulous thing that we recognize to be American show business, and that American show business is a creation of people other than establishment.
There is a difference. I mean, I believe the feeling of community is much stronger in Canada than in the States. I mean, I think that you're an exception because what's interesting about you is that you trade on the sense of community. I mean, that's what your television station's about.
That's right.
All the
because
time.
I believe in tradition. I like tradition.
But it's the Canadian tradition you're going back to.
Good afternoon. It's 5 o'clock. I'm Gord Martineau. A damp day here in Toronto, and our weather specialist, Brian Hill, says we are in for another drizzly one tomorrow with the highs only around +2. Right now, it is +5 degrees in Toronto.
Everybody who works in the station is encouraged to bring their experiences in the next day, to make us aware of those things which are genuinely a part of their life rather than things that are assigned to them by some kind of more remote mechanism or some set of impulses that they acquire from the morning's press releases.
Bodies discovered in a ravine at the Glen Stewart Park in the Glen Manor Road and Kingston Road area about 3:30 yesterday afternoon. Crime specialist Mark Haley will bring us that story 1 hour from now.
Our reporters are aware every day that this is a station that is located in the gritty downtown center, and it's true. There's something about your worldview which is affected by whether or not you're located in the core of the city or whether you're located at the end of a superhighway. In Agincourt is one of our competitors located, or if you're in the manicured suburbs of Don Mills, for example. There is an important difference in attitude and in the way you approach the living life of town. We see the overall challenge as one of communicating the ongoing soap opera of the city of Toronto. Last night I was giving a speech to the Institute of Chief Financial Executives, and sitting at the head table with me were people from Stelco and Inco and major oil company, major food company, major petrochemical company. And so when I began to give my talk, I told them that I thought it was entirely appropriate that after the establishment took down the fundamentals, they supplied the bread and the salt and the heat and the light that it seemed entirely appropriate that I came along and sold what I sold, which was air. I sell air. I got a good laugh out of that.
When I come up here, I find myself talking to this old city hall. Babe, you're wonderful. She's inside of you. She's the great presiding duchess. That constant juxtaposition of a great, a grand, an ample, a bosomy Victorian tradition. And then next door, the full modern cerebrality of the new city hall.
What's impressive about Nathan Phillips Square is that it really does become the center of the city. It's a place where people think they should be gathering because it feels nice. It's a good and natural space for them. And to me, the reason why that is why it happens is that it's sort of the focal point for all the intensity in the city. It's the gathering up place where things actually do come together. It can only happen because around it are a great deal of intense activities, people working in great close proximity to each other, or shopping, or in fact living relatively closely to each other. And it's sort of that all that comes together in the square. Part of the success, I guess, relates to the fact that it's enclosed. It's not limitless, but around the exterior of it is a limit, a fence, that says, hold on a second, we've got some activity, but it doesn't go forever. We have to set human limits. If you've got a lot of people living really close together, it's quite clear that you have to set the bounds as to exactly how far people can go, what the limits of behavior are, what the limits of one person's property are. And the way that that's best expressed in the city is in terms of the fence. Fences are really necessary because they're the dividing lines between people. They're the protections that people have. I think it's fascinating that wherever you go in Toronto, people have erected those fences in either bushes or wood or stone or what have you. They recognize that you have to do that if you're going to survive fairly well in the city. And it's not a sign of hostility toward other people, it's a sign of getting along with other people.
It's seen everything, Yonge Street. It's seen the Northwest Company hauling their boats up Yonge Street. And of course it's seen railway engines built at Goods Foundry at the corner, I think Yonge and Queen, go down to the lake. So it's had ships riding. It had me for 7 years, and this was a Yonge Street fantasy. I represented the ward which runs from Bloor right to the city limits along Yonge Street. But pretty much everything that's happened to me since I was born has happened within a few hundred yards of Yonge Street. Typical of the best of what Yonge Street can happen is Gloucester Mews behind me there, which is a nice mix of all kinds of things. You've got a great restaurant, and you've got a variety of interesting specialty shops. Over there, well, they were massage parlors and whorehouses. Now, they are among Toronto's finest high Victorian residences, again, which they were in the first place, here on St. Joseph Street. A little further down St. Joseph's, I can remember the Commissioner of Works wanting to do what was called the throat widening. Well, we had a compromise on that, but the throat widening incident led to all kinds of debates about where the city goes. Do you want your throat widened? No, Yonge Street's throat and St. Joseph Street throat should remain narrow, and then it can become the domain of the pedestrian, of the person who wants to enjoy it and move slowly. Toronto grew up alongside Yonge Street. Yonge Street is a reflection of the city itself. Even its most ardent admirers would hardly call the picture grand or beautiful. A patchwork of preoccupations and uses, a pawn shop of our several urban dreams, a cacophony of unfinished business, ripe for bankruptcy or for the quick profit of wallet or soul, a string of little shopping districts and big stores, a street vendor's haven, a sin strip, a stroller's alley, a mix of ritzy and rubby and rube. To dedicated boosters of Toronto, Yonge Street is an outright offense. A few years ago, Alan Jarvis described it as 400 outhouses leaning up against Eaton's. Nathan Phillips called it a disgrace to a city of the size and importance of Toronto, but he never managed to change it.
First came in was my reaction to seeing my town. What you get 2 days later is me seeing the faces in that town. What struck me walking across Bloor Street was a muted sorrow, a sense of half-recognized guilt and complicity, and a profound sense of loss.
It's all glass and glare and glitz and false panache. Instant New York rigor mortis imported into Toronto. I thought I would be intrigued. In fact, I was simply numbed out. It's the experience of reducing life of the mind, life of the spirit, or eros, the erotic life. It's simply reduced to the jigglings of the genitalia. It doesn't really matter what gender you are. There are all genders in there, and they're all mixed up. But it's reduced to the jiggling of the genitalia. Eros dies. Any joust with the gods dies. It's just sex across the counter with a drink. They're not sex hustlers in the usual sense of the word, so far as I can see. They're all busy hustling careers over each other's bodies.
You simply can't use the word carnal discussing Toronto. Toronto is too Protestant for that. Toronto is too dissociated from its body. Well, a city that has a sense of the carnal has a sense of the erotic. Toronto has no sense of the erotic. Toronto will allow you sexual freedom because it's afraid of erotic freedom.
Sex is something you can get rid of. Eros is something you don't get rid of.
Maybe we go back to something Moses raised, or implied, that what happens in Toronto now is what's going to happen in other Canadian cities. It takes 20 years now. His point being that Toronto is, so to speak, the Toronto experiment now is the blueprint experiment, in a sense, for cities right across this country.
The immigrants in Toronto, in the city of Toronto at that
helped
point,
us do that. We're Americans.
couldn't vote. The first generation ones who came after the war, in fact, had already then moved up to North York. And look at the council they've got. Look what they've got. I mean, they've got people who love the American dream. The main threats the suburbs pose are both to wipe out communities and to try and get rid of the mingling of uses that appears in the city. The dominant characteristics of the suburbs is that you separate things out. You have some kind of people living here and another kind of people living here. That you have certain kinds of uses here and other kinds of uses there. That's totally opposed to the idea of the city where, in fact, things are literally thrown together. In some cases not too well, where we have lead factories very close to where people live. That's a situation where it doesn't work, but most other cases it does work. Corner stores right beside where people live, people living over stores, apartments right beside houses, and those kinds of things. So the suburbs attempts to wipe that out and tries to say, wait a minute, that's not the way things should happen. And it does it by constructing massive transportation routes which really do try and separate things. That transportation route, which gets people out from where they live to where they work, really begins to destroy the city in a way that's not even subtle. I think that when people were fighting the Spadina Expressway, they were recognizing that that was the actual threat that was occurring. Things are designed so that you can't be political. You want to have a march in the suburbs, so where do you march? You can march in the main street, but the main street of North York happens to be the 401, where you're liable to get killed. There are no other main streets. Well, shopping centers, and of course you can't march inside a shopping center, they'll kick you out.
Suburban view of Toronto, though the suburban politicians never go to the island, is typified by their attitude to the island. There are no bicycle chain store gangs, there is no crime, there's no shopping malls, there's nothing on the island. It's all inconvenient, and therefore they kind of dismiss it as a swamp, or it's either rich hippies or poor ne'er-do-wells, or both at once, and somehow it must be obliterated. And the suburban view of Yonge Street, of course, is that it's got to be made one way, 4-track, zoom down, and you zoom back on Church or Bay or somewhere else. Nestled right against the corner of Yonge and Bloor, and in the insurance alley with these huge glossy new insurance buildings, is a preserved slice of late Victorian, early 20th century Edwardian Toronto. Collier Street has a very vigorous community association. It's seen to it that that's been preserved. You can have in Toronto a small residential community, and there's hundreds of them like this and bigger, nestled up against the high-rise and the offices.
Toronto comes up again and again as a little piece of paradise in a way that really all of Canada is. It's a little piece of paradise, and the bulk of our complaints, which I think are complaints about the absence of energy at a limit point, the absence about passion and so on, are the nicest kinds of complaints. It means that the lows aren't as low here because we take care, and the highs aren't as high because you're not allowed.
I fear that, in fact, Toronto can be destroyed just as other cities have been destroyed. There's no magic in the fact that this happens to be Toronto and it happens to be working, and therefore it'll always work. The pressure of the suburbs is very strong. The suburban politicians are in positions of power at the city and the provincial level, and there's some question as to how strongly people in Toronto can continue to put up the fight with all these threats. I'm very hopeful that, in fact, people will be able to do that, but if people are always under stress, I think that they'll start to collapse, and that's my fear.
Whether you've just arrived from the Azores 10 years ago and you paint your house blue or pink, or you've been a WASP in Rosedale and you're pretty angry about everything, and you think everybody should be forced into the army or should be subjected to capital punishment, those people all got somehow together, and they did take power in the city, and it didn't happen in any other North American city, and that can never change. I'm pleased about that, and I think from that launching pad, Moses' vision of the future can happen.
Toronto is a permanent rebellion against an establishment it always wants to be part of.
Well, I was going to try this. Self-consciousness is provincial, but there's nothing wrong with a little consciousness of self. And precisely because there is the understatement of a John Sewell, there is also room for a little of the overstatement, if you will, of a Moses Znaimer. It's the amalgam that makes the city of tomorrow that interests me.
That was an elegant statement.
Well, I always have problems about people who say that tomorrow is going to be better than today. That I'm not willing to.
I always used to think it was going to be worse.
Well, I'm
Not
not
so sure
willing to
now.
say it's worse either. The question is, what one is doing today to make today secure.
Tough one to love, and yet it's a magnificent one. It's easy to love Paris. Any fool can love Paris. It's easy to love London. My God, it's difficult to love this city. And when one does, one's hooked for it.
My interest and my nationalism is defined by curiosity about what it is we're going to work out, rather than by any intense allegiance to something that came before. And yet, I live in a world of clear alternatives, and I choose to celebrate Toronto because compared to every other place I go to, the people are open-minded. Well, there's this wonderful combination of open-mindedness and phlegma that makes for a really civilized life.
Yes, but I don't see
and
your...
it's a rare combination, and I'm proud to be...
Yeah, see, I would argue very strongly that the reason that in Toronto it works well is because people feel that they're part of a real community.
Yeah, I can't
whereas
and I think
in most other places they don't.
And I disagree with Moses' point that there has to be an argument between an allegiance to what came before and what we are yet to work out. To me, what's exciting about Toronto is those two things together. Yeah. What we will work out will also be partly a relationship. Yeah. Sure, and that's what's exciting, and we have those roots, and we have to work out new things, and that's exciting. What's extraordinary to me in this evening is the similarity of our viewpoints from extraordinarily different backgrounds, points of view, etc., etc. The similarity as we move along in the evening. That's what's extraordinary.
Yes, yes. And for me, that's part of what I try and celebrate. I think this is a wonderfully civilized city. I mean, I'm conscious every day as I leaf through the papers or watch the news on city that this is a world where we still kill each other for points of difference. And in Toronto, somehow, we've institutionalized the differences and the value of the differences and make of them really a remarkable paradise, really. And those alternatives for me are stark.
What's the defining sense of the city? I'll tell you right now. Here is a Baptist sitting on my side. Here's Grandma Moses over here from the great Liberal Party. He's the grand pangendrum of the Liberal Party. We have Moses Znaimer in from Montreal, who's constantly telling us that he comes from the wrong side of the tracks, and it's supposed to make me flinch, because I came from what is now the wrong side of the tracks. He's from the right side of the track. We've got
Who's doing well coming from the wrong side.
Right. And here's the old boy from Rosedale who lives on 10 grand a year and is lucky if he gets it. What is the uniting factor? Do you know what's united us? It's not verbal at all. A certain decorum throughout the entire dinner, a certain courtesy of treatment of the other person who's talking, even a certain courtliness in dealing with the point that's presented. That's what's bound us.
Well, I want to drink to that. This is a very civilized place to live. Here's to you, L'chaim.
And that, which was the most Toronto, was something we enacted more than talking.
When you contemplate different cities, you realize that being a citizen of Paris is a privilege, or being a citizen of London is a ritual, it's a rite. Being a New Yorker is to be born, whether you like it or not, as one of the kings of the world. But being a Torontonian is a fate. It's a fate. And it's implacable and it's relentless as a fate because of this. Toronto has to resolve the meanings of the great chivalric traditions and roots of Europe on the one hand, and the utilitarian meanings of North America on the other. And that is why it's a fate.